Boss claimed my disability was an excuse for laziness. Publicly shamed me at a meeting. I sued the company for discrimination, won $2 million, and he was fired on the spot. So, there I was, lying in bed at 7 in the morning, dreading another day at work. Most people don't exactly love their jobs, sure, but this was different. I was a nervous wreck each morning, like I was a kid trying to get out of going to school by claiming I had a fever. Only I was a 35-year-old adult with a mortgage, car payments, and medical bills piling up on my kitchen counter. The reason I dreaded work so much had a name: Alan Marks, my boss. It wasn't that Alan was just your usual tough love kind of manager. This man was something else. He seemed to get genuine satisfaction out of making people feel small, out of catching someone in a minor mistake and blowing it up as if the company's future rested on that one misstep. You know, the kind of boss that emails you at 11 p.m. and expects a reply by 11:05? That's Alan. He managed a small team in our finance department, and each of us had stories of him belittling us, calling us soft, or saying we just weren't cut out for the real world. But today, I was feeling worse than usual. It had been a rough night with muscle spasms in my legs, one of the many fun symptoms of multiple sclerosis. They hadn't stopped until 4 a.m., which meant I'd gotten a grand total of 3 hours of sleep. My muscles felt like they'd been put through a meat grinder, and I was dizzy just lying there, staring at the ceiling. I pulled out my phone and stared at it, trying to muster the energy to text Alan that I wouldn't make it in. I knew what kind of response I'd get, but the thought of actually dragging myself to the office made me nauseous. So I typed up a quick message. Hey Alan, I'm not feeling well this morning, likely due to my MS flare-up last night. I'll work remotely today and stay logged in for anything urgent. Not 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I didn't even have to check, I knew it was him. Hey, Alan, I said, trying to sound more awake than I was. He didn't even bother with a greeting. Will, we're in crunch time here. You can't just work remotely whenever you feel a little off. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Alan, it's not just feeling off. I mentioned this to you when I started, remember? Yeah, I remember, he snapped. And I remember you saying it wouldn't affect your job. I'm still doing my job, Alan. It's just, some days, I need a bit of flexibility. I'm not asking for time off. Just to work from home when my symptoms flare up. He laughed, actually laughed. Will, we're not running a charity here. Everyone's got symptoms and problems. You think I don't wake up tired? Or that other people on the team don't have things going on? It's called adulthood. Suck it up. The line went quiet for a moment. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples. I am sucking it up, Alan. Every day. But some things, they're just not. They're not something I can push through. You're not in my body. Right, he said dismissively, but I am your boss. And I'm telling you, get it together. You can't keep hiding behind this condition every time things get tough. If you can't handle the job, maybe we need to find someone who can. I stared at the ceiling, swallowing back the anger. I'd heard plenty of horror stories about disability discrimination, but I'd never expected to be on the receiving end like this. But what could I do? I had bills, a mortgage, and medical expenses. I needed this job. I'll be online in 10 minutes, I muttered. Good, he said, his tone smug. And Will, let's make sure this doesn't become a pattern. The call ended, leaving me feeling hollow and furious. He'd barely tried to understand, hadn't even paused to consider what I might be going through. The day dragged on, with me working from my bed, feeling like a failure just for taking care of myself. 2 days later, Alan called a team meeting at the last minute. That wasn't unusual, he liked to throw people off their game, see who was really dedicated, as he put it. I made my way to the conference room, my legs aching with every step. As I walked in, Alan gave me a once-over, his eyes narrowing just slightly. I knew that look. He was gearing up for something. The meeting started off normally enough, Alan droning on about quarterly goals, revenue projections, all the usual corporate nonsense. But then his tone shifted, grew sharper, and I felt a pit form in my stomach. All right, he said, glancing around the table, we need to address an issue here. Some people seem to think that the rules don't apply to them. That they can work when they feel like it, take time off whenever they're not feeling well. He emphasized the words with finger quotes, looking right at me. The silence in the room was thick, uncomfortable. I could feel my coworkers' eyes on me, some sympathetic, others just awkward. No one was going to speak up. Alan continued, his voice dripping with condescension. If you're not up to the job, maybe you shouldn't be here. We're all dealing with stress, with problems. But we don't use them as an excuse to slack off. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. This was beyond unprofessional. It was humiliating. He was singling me out, using my condition as a tool to make an example of me. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I couldn't just sit there and take it. Alan, I said, my voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't use my condition as an excuse. I work just as hard as anyone else here. But MS isn't something I can control." He raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Oh? So we're supposed to make special allowances for you, is that it? While everyone else has to follow the rules?" "It's not about special allowances," I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "It's about basic decency. I'm not asking for time off, I'm asking for the option to work remotely on bad days. That's reasonable." He shrugged, clearly unimpressed. "If you think it's reasonable, then maybe this job isn't the right fit for you, Will. We need people who can show up. Every day." The meeting ended on that note, and I left feeling utterly humiliated. I could barely look at my coworkers as I walked out, my head down, every step feeling heavier than the last. That night, I sat on the phone with my sister Val, finally spilling everything. She listened, her voice tight with anger as she spoke. "Will, you have to do something. This is straight up illegal. He can't treat you like that." "I don't know, Val," I said, feeling defeated. "I mean, it's his word against mine, and he's the boss. It doesn't matter. You've got a right to reasonable accommodations. That's federal law." "Yeah, but HR." I trailed off. I knew that HR was practically in Alan's pocket, they'd brushed me off before when I'd raised concerns. Val was silent for a moment, and then she spoke with a fierceness I rarely heard from her. "Then you go above them. You find a lawyer. Will, don't let this guy bully you." Her words hung in the air, giving me a spark of hope. Maybe I didn't have to take this lying down. Maybe there was a way to stand up for myself. The next day, I made the call. I found a lawyer who specialized in disability discrimination and explained my situation, sparing no detail. She listened carefully, asking pointed questions, her tone calm and professional. "Will, you've got a strong case here," she told me. "He's violated your rights, and if HR hasn't supported you, they're complicit. We can take this to court." My stomach twisted at the thought, but I knew she was right. I was tired of being pushed around, tired of feeling helpless. We filed the lawsuit, listing every instance of harassment, every comment, every refusal to accommodate. I documented everything, even started recording our meetings just to have proof. It was exhausting, stressful beyond words, but it felt like taking back a little bit of control. Months later, we were in court. Alan looked rattled for the first time, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged. He tried to paint me as unreliable, as someone looking for a handout. But the evidence was stacked against him, emails, recordings, even testimonies from a couple of brave coworkers who'd seen how he treated me. When the verdict came, the judge ruled in my favor. Alan was ordered to pay $2 million in damages, a figure that made my head spin. But it wasn't about the money. It was about finally standing up for myself. As the verdict settled in the courtroom, there was a moment of stunned silence. Alan sat there, staring at the judge with an expression that mixed fury and disbelief. His eyes darted toward me, narrow and cold, but I held his gaze, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: power. It wasn't the aggressive kind of power he'd wielded over me for months, it was the quiet strength of knowing I'd stood up for myself, for once, and won. My lawyer, Sarah, leaned over and whispered, "You did it, Will. You actually did it." I gave a small nod, too overwhelmed to say anything. The judge concluded with a stern warning to Alan about violating federal law, emphasizing how serious the situation was. As I walked out of the courtroom, I caught sight of Alan being approached by two men in suits, the corporate lawyers he'd been so sure would eat me alive. The irony was almost sweet. Outside, I found Val waiting on the courthouse steps. The moment she saw me, she rushed over and threw her arms around me. "Will, I'm so proud of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. I hugged her back, feeling a weight finally lifting off my shoulders. "I still can't believe it," I said, half laughing, half shaking. "I mean, $2 million. And Alan. He's done. Fired, just like that." She pulled back, looking me straight in the eyes. "He deserved every bit of it. For what he put you through. I can't believe he thought he could get away with that." We stood there, soaking in the victory. For so long, I'd felt trapped, like I was in a constant battle with my body, with my job, with a system that didn't seem to care. And now, for once, I felt like I'd actually made a difference, not just for myself, but maybe for others who'd felt they didn't have a voice. The days that followed were surreal. Word spread quickly through the company about what had happened. I received dozens of emails from coworkers and people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were just supportive messages, others were from people who had faced similar situations and were inspired by my case to take action. Even a few members of Alan's team, who'd always seemed distant, reached out with their own stories of his harsh treatment and relentless criticism. One email, though, stood out. It was from an old friend and former colleague, Liam, who now worked at a competing firm. Liam had been one of the few people who knew about my MS from the beginning, and he'd been supportive, offering me advice and encouragement whenever I was feeling low. "Will, I heard about your win. Congratulations doesn't even cover it, man. Alan deserved every bit of that. If you're ever interested, we'd love to have you over here at Stanford Holdings. I'll put in a good word. We've got remote work options and plenty of flexibility. No Alan marks here, I promise." I reread the message 3 times, grinning. It was tempting, especially after everything that had happened. But I needed time to really think about what I wanted, what direction my life should take next. For the first time in years, I felt like I actually had options. The money from the settlement meant I didn't have to jump into another job just to survive. I could take a break, focus on my health, and maybe even think about what I actually wanted to do with my life. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the trial, I decided to pay a visit to my mom. She'd been one of my biggest supporters throughout the whole ordeal, even if she'd always worried that I was too proud for my own good, as she'd often reminded me. I could tell the lawsuit had made her anxious, but in the end, she was incredibly proud that I'd followed through with it. When I arrived, she greeted me with a warm hug and a look that could only be described as relief. "Will, you look lighter. Like a weight's been lifted," she said, her smile softening the usual worry lines on her face. "I feel lighter," I admitted, settling into the familiar worn-out chair in her living room. "It's like I can finally breathe. I didn't realize how much stress I'd been carrying around." She nodded, her eyes bright. "You've been through a lot, honey. And you didn't deserve any of it." We sat there, catching up, laughing about old memories, and talking about what lay ahead. For the first time, I didn't feel like my life was defined by my illness, or my job, or any of the limitations I'd placed on myself. I felt free. As I was getting ready to leave, she took my hand and looked at me with that mom look, the one that sees straight through any armor you're wearing. "Whatever you do next, Will, make sure it's something that makes you happy. Not just something that pays the bills, okay?" I nodded, squeezing her hand. "I will, Mom. I promise." A few months later, I found myself back in Chicago, but this time, I wasn't trudging to an office or worrying about some impossible deadline. I was at a cafe with Liam, who'd been keeping tabs on my progress since the trial. I'd turned down his job offer, deciding instead to pursue a consulting role where I could work on my own terms, advising companies on disability accommodations and workplace equity. "So, no Alan Marks at Stanford, huh?" I joked, sipping my coffee. Liam laughed. "None at all. And if there were, we'd boot him out before he got through the door. How's the consulting gig treating you?" I smiled, genuinely content for the first time in years. "It's amazing, actually. I get to help companies avoid turning into places like where we worked." "You're making a difference, Will. Seriously." It felt surreal, but I knew he was right. I was finally doing something meaningful, using my experiences, the good and the ugly, to make workplaces better for people like me. People who just needed a little understanding, a little flexibility, to thrive. I glanced out the cafe window, watching the bustling streets of Chicago, the endless energy that pulsed through the city. For the first time, I wasn't overwhelmed by it. I was part of it, contributing in my own way, on my own terms. As we got up to leave, Liam clapped me on the back and grinned. "You really did it, Will. You took down a giant. Don't forget that." I nodded, feeling a warmth settle in my chest. I'd come so far from that terrified guy who'd almost caved under Alan's scrutiny, who'd worried so much about what people would think. I'd stood up, fought back, and won, not just for myself, but for everyone who'd ever felt like their struggles were dismissed or belittled. As I walked away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't thought was possible. I wasn't the same person I'd been a year ago. I'd faced my fears, redefined my worth, and found a strength I hadn't known I had. The scars Alan had left were still there, but they didn't define me. They were just reminders of a battle I'd fought and won. And as I headed home, I knew, deep down, that whatever came next, I'd be okay. I'd finally reclaimed my life, and nothing, not MS, not a bad boss, not even my own doubts, could take that away.